continuing the trend of milking IPs for all they're worth, despite the fact that nobody is asking for them, a 300 TV series is reportedly in early development at Warner Brothers Television. Additionally, the director of the original movie, Zack Snyder, is in talks to return and direct the series as well. Stick around to find out what else we know about this upcoming property and what it might be about. I'm Brendan Sem for the New Wave Nerds. Subscribe down below for more nerd content and commentary. Now let's read the news. From Variety, exclusive 300 TV series in early development at Warner Brothers Television. A 300 TV series is in early development at Warner Brothers Television, Variety has learned from sources. Exact plot details are still being worked out, but sources say that the show would serve as a prequel to the 2006 film. No writer or platform is currently attached to the project. Deals are still being negotiated, but Zack Snyder, who directed and co-wrote 300, is in talks to direct and executive produce the series. Deborah Snyder, who executive produced 300, would also return as an executive producer under her and Zack's Stone Quarry production banner, with Stone Quarry's Wesley Collar also on board. Gianni Nunari, Mark Canton, and Bernie Goldman, all of whom were producers on the film, are likewise in talks to return for the series. Reps for Warner Brothers TV declined to comment at this time. So this is another announcement that I definitely didn't think we needed this week. If we had never seen this, I think I would probably be able to sleep just fine, and never would I have dreamed and longed for this series to be made. Now, don't get me wrong, I really like the 300 movie, the original one from 2006. I think it's amazing. It's incredibly fun. I think it's wonderful. It's perfect for what it is, which is a Zack Snyder action film. It tells a wonderful story of duty and honor, and of the victory of the West over the East. And the Battle of Thermopylae is obviously it's a cornerstone moment for Western culture as it is, and the film itself is adapted from a wonderful novel written by Frank Miller, which itself is loosely based upon the real-life events of the Battle of Thermopylae, and the film is incredibly fun. I think the direction is great. It feels very much like a telling of a mythical tale. The use of throughout the entire film of the sound stage and the use of green screen is not something that I would typically enjoy. Generally, I prefer the practical effects and shooting on location, but I think this film did do it well. It was clear that it was filmed on a sound stage and in green screen, but they really leaned into that and really emphasized the sort of mythological aspect of this tale. And so I think the film itself is really good. But despite that, I don't think this series is necessary at all. I don't think this serves any real purpose. I don't think there needs to be a prequel series to 300. I think, don't get me wrong, there are obviously battles and events that happen prior to the Battle of Thermopylae that I think would be really interested to be seen and adapted on screen. But if I'm going to see them adapted, I want to see them actually adapted in a real sort of historical epic type setting. I don't want it to be a fictional dramatization a la 300. I want it to be an actual representation of what happens at these battles. And so this series, I don't think necessarily serves anything or anyone. Now, that being said, I think there are some really interesting events that this story could center around, right? So, as mentioned in the article, we don't know for sure, but some of the sources have claimed that this is a prequel series. Now, the question, I suppose, is how much of a prequel is this? Is it a direct prequel that's going to follow, say, the rise of Leonidas or the rise of Xerxes? Or is this going to be a more broader prequel? Is this going to be the thing that sets the foundations of the relationships between the Persians and the Greeks as we see it in 300? That's what I would like to see. if this is going to be a prequel, I don't want it to be direct. I want it to be fairly removed from the movie as it stands. I think the movie itself is good. It's a standalone story that I don't think is served by any supplemental material. I think 300 Rise of an Empire, I believe 2014 sequel, was not very well done. I don't think it serves the purpose at all, and I don't think, or rather, my worry with a direct prequel is that the series itself is not well done, or that I don't necessarily like the story, and that it negatively impacts the 300 film, right? If this is a very direct prequel, then events that happen in the series would directly affect the events that happen in the movie. And so if there's a lack of continuity there, I think that leads to, a higher potential of the series not being very good. And so because of that, I want it to be fairly removed, and I would like it to, as I mentioned, set the stage for the relations as we see them in 300, right? Because this battle at the Hot Gates, the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of the 300, is not the first interaction between the Greeks and the Persians, in history at least. I don't know how it's necessarily portrayed in the film. It might be shown as though it's the first interaction, but I don't believe so. But there is a massive battle which also turns the tide and is a huge event as far as Western culture and Western civilization stands writ large, and that is the Battle of Marathon. It happens 10 years before the Battle of the Hot Gates and is a similar story. It tells of Persian expansion and the Greeks pushing back against all odds. Now, the Battle of Marathon is the origin of where we get the marathon race, because as the legend goes, a messenger is sent from the battle, and he runs 25 miles from the battle site to Athens, and delivers his final message of the victory, and then collapses and dies right there on the spot. And it's from this where we get the what's a marathon? Is it 25.6 miles? I don't know. I think it's 25.6. That's not important, but that is the origin of that, and so it's a really important fight because, again, it sets up the relations between the Greeks and the Persian Empire, right? And it sets the stage for the political relations between Athens and Sparta and the various city-states in the Greek peninsula standing up against this massive empire. And so I think that would be a really, really interesting area to explore. Now, I guess there is no true reason to believe that this would necessarily be only about the Greeks. I mean, it's feasible that they could do the prequel series, and as I alluded to earlier, do like an origin for Xerxes, or maybe follow his father Darius. That could be done as well. That would actually be really interesting. That would actually be really cool. I wouldn't be opposed to that. The Persian Empire has a very vast history as well. And that is also more possible because Zack Snyder himself has talked about the potentiality of doing various 300 sequels and expanding out the time periods and the cultures that we explore. I know that the only one off the top of my head that I know that he's mentioned is the American Revolution, but I believe he's also mentioned... No, I don't think there was anything more recent than the Revolution. I think everything else was prior to that. But that's something that I think could be interesting as well, and sort of further sets the stage for expanding out this idea of exploring these stories of tremendous self-sacrifice and duty and honor. And that's what I think needs to be maintained in this series. That's the theme that needs to hold true. And that needs to hold true for any subsequent 300 material if the series does well and they decide to move forward with some of Snyder's plans. I think that theme has to remain there, because that is what makes 300 300. It is the self-sacrifice of these few, relatively few Spartan warriors. It is the honor and duty that these men have, and their belief that this is their destiny, right? That it is their job and their destiny to die to protect their loved ones, their home, their culture, right? And so I think that is what needs to be pulled through and further pushed with all of the subsequent material. Now, as I mentioned, Snyder has talked about various different ideas for potential sequels that he has. I mentioned the Revolutionary War one, but he did have plans for a direct 300 sequel. And while the subject matter of that doesn't necessarily have any impact on this series or the potentiality of it or anything, it does show that Snyder has plans to expand this universe writ large. And should this series end up doing well, or even, getting made, because that's frankly kind of still up in the air, there are potentials for this to further expand out. And so I have this article from The Hollywood Reporter. This is a fairly old one. This comes from December of 2023. Exclusive: Zack Snyder regains rights to Blood and Ashes script originally pitched as a 300 sequel. The filmmaker wrote the script for Warner Brothers, but it ended up going in a different direction. Zack Snyder may have his hands full launching Rebel Moon, his sci-fi fantasy film that Netflix unveils December 22. You can skip it, but that doesn't mean the energetic filmmaker isn't busy developing other projects. Enter Blood and Ashes. The film began life as a sequel to 300 and 300 Rise of an Empire, and was one of the last projects Snyder worked on before officially leaving Warner Brothers after the debacle that was Justice League. But what he turned in was quite different from a 300 sequel. Blood and Ashes, which he partially wrote while shooting Army of the Dead for Netflix in 2019, ended up focusing on the relationship between Alexander the Great and his second-in-command, Hephaestion. It was a gay love story that was also an ancient Greek war epic, one he said then Warner's executive Courtney Valenti liked and championed. The studio, perhaps unsurprisingly given its subject matter and the tense circumstances between itself and the filmmaker following his exit from Justice League, ultimately didn't go for it. But the project, co-written by longtime collaborator Kurt Johnstad, may be back in play, as Snyder recently told THR that he and his wife and producing partner Deborah Snyder have gotten the rights back from the studio and are free to shop it elsewhere. We got the rights back so we can make it if we want. I don't know what the marketplace is for an incredibly homoerotic, super violent, super sexual movie, but maybe it's perfect. What is no longer in play, however, actually we're going to skip that because that just goes in a completely different route. So here's the deal. I think a story following Alexander the Great would be really interesting. This is a man who is incredibly monumental, again, in Western civilization and just in global history writ large. Alexander the Great, Alexander the Conqueror of Macedonia. This is a man who brought a large portion of the known world underneath his thumb, and he did it at a very young age. I believe I want to say he was like mid-20s when he was in Egypt looking at the Great Sphinx. I think he was in his mid to early 20s. He was not very far along at all. And so this is a man who I would absolutely love to see explored. And I don't know much about the relationship between Alexander the Great and Hephaestion. Whatever. I guess my thing is that, like, I feel like you should probably spend most of the time focusing on the war epic, really, because, that is what the franchise is mostly really about. Granted, as Snyder himself has mentioned, there is quite a bit of homoeroticism in the original 300, just based on the society of the Spartans at the time, right? But I think the problem, I suppose, here is that we when doing stories and adapting and telling about how life and society was in the ancient Greek world during this high classical period, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. We sort of look at it through the lens of how we view sexuality now, and how we view like relationships now. But Greek society looked at it in a very different way. And so I'm not opposed to exploring the relationship between Alexander the Great and Hephaestion. But it is worth noting that this homosexual relationship between these two men would not be the way that we envision it now. It wouldn't be a modern... how do they describe it? It's not like a modern gay love story. It is an ancient Greek gay love story, which views the relationships between the genders in a sexual way. They view it differently. This is explored a lot in Plato's Symposium. It's sort of further... If you want a good overview of the differences and the differences in the perception of love and sex and relationships, Plato's Symposium is a really, really good look into that. The Socrates gives his own view, and there is, I want to say, 3 or 4 different viewpoints. I think there's Epididymis and not important. Plato's Symposium is absolutely worth the read. It's very short. It's only like, I think it's less than 100 pages. So absolutely worth picking up. And so I'm not necessarily opposed to exploring that story and that relationship. I think it could be really, really cool. Alexander the Great is, like I mentioned, just a tremendous, tremendous figure. And so there is a lot to explore there. And so, like, don't get me, like, I like the 300 movie, and I really like Watchmen, but I've really soured on Zack Snyder over the past couple years or so. Unfortunately, there have just been a couple of like really disappointing outings. Most recently with Rebel Moon Part 1, just an absolute disappointment. I'm a Snyder fan, and so I want to see him succeed, and so I hope that this series does well, and I hope that it does spawn a franchise that can maybe be explored, not because I think it needs to be, but just because, like I said, I do like Zack Snyder, and I always like to see him do more things. He doesn't make capital G great films all that often, but he does make very good, very enjoyable films, at least in my opinion. I really liked Army of the Dead. Watchmen is probably his closest thing to a capital G great film, but even that has its misgivings. So I really do hope, I want to see this man succeed, even if I don't want to see the series and the franchise succeed. And so if the series does well and that involves him getting multiple, a deal where he can pursue some of these sequels, whether it's Alexander the Great and Hephaestion, or we're looking at the Revolutionary War or some other time period, or we're looking at Darius or Xerxes over in Persia. I think that is really, I would be here for that. If not for the franchise as a whole, because I don't think it necessarily needs to be made at all, and I would be much happier if it weren't being made. But if it is going to be made, I hope it does well, so that Zack Snyder can continue to move forth and hopefully do more projects and hopefully not let me down anymore. But we'll just have to wait and see. There's really no telling. Zack Snyder is very hit or miss. We don't have much now, so we don't even have a release date, but we'll definitely keep you apprised as more information comes available in relation to this series. Let me know down below in the comments, is this one that you're interested in seeing, or like me, do you think that this did not need to be made at all? And if they do continue to make a bunch of sequels, what are some other time periods and battles that you would like to see explored? Where else would you like to see this taken? Obviously, we've talked about Revolutionary War. Are there any other battles you would like to see? If we're talking about American history, maybe the Civil War, or global history, maybe World Wars I or II, or some more smaller local regional battles. That would be really interesting as well. Maybe get something looking at The English Civil War, that would be really fun. I don't know. I don't know if there's any battles that necessarily match the theme in that, but I think the period itself is fairly interesting. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Do you have any ideas? But we will be back here tomorrow with a brand new segment, and I will see you guys then.